We're live, folks. So, gents, thank you for joining me for the inaugural episode of the Bitcoiner Book Club. Today, we are going to be discussing a seminal work in the Bitcoin space. One is the one that is often recommended, and one that I have to admit I was late to reading. Only just finished it recently, and that is The Sovereign Individual. From my perspective, what I thought was interesting about this book was it provided a kind of unified context through which a unified context to interpret the evolution of history. And I think a lot of us probably looked at the disparate individual characteristics of history, whether it be information technology or obviously with Bitcoin, or the changes in weaponry, or whatever lens we looked through before. But at least for me, it was all kind of disparate, and this really helped bring it all together and put a cherry on the top for a way to interpret how things change. And it actually ended up giving me kind of a sense of peace about how everything is unfolding. And it's worth noting that this was written in 97, 98, I believe. And much of what it referred to and predicted, I think we're seeing in many different manifestations in culture around the world today. I think that's part of the reason why it's so interesting, and that it's so prescient, and that its predictive power has been so accurate. So I thought this would be a great book to start this Bitcoiner Book Club sort of podcast. And I thank you guys all for being here. And why don't we just go around? You guys can do a brief introduction at whatever level you're comfortable with, and then maybe just give your 2 cents about the book, and then we'll dive into the specifics. Blake, why don't you get us kicked off?
Yeah, great. So nice to meet you all. I've been Bitcoiner for a while. Got into it a while back, not as early as I would have liked. But I kind of felt what was in this book was already kind of happening. Obviously, 2008 was very impactful for me, and starting to understand the Federal Reserve and supporting Ron Paul. Just felt like a plebe, maybe not be the right word, but just like a serf where, felt uncontrolled, don't have any power and in control. Obviously Bitcoin came along and I just got it. So it was nice to understand the problem and then find the solution. The Sovereign Individual for me is a great book because it takes a 10,000 year view of history, and it really becomes obvious to me how impactful cryptocurrency, or obviously Bitcoin, is going to be in that the change that's happening to society in a positive way. So the biggest theme for me in the book was the return on violence. Which is the idea that if you were to rob somebody, what are the returns you can get versus the risk, you being killed versus you being able to take that asset. And I start to think through, almost all of history and think what and how it would have been changed if Bitcoin was around. So Columbus invading the Aztec Empire and stealing their gold, if they were able to put it on a treasure hardware wallet and be able to email it to a friend, in North America or vice versa, like that would change history and the return on violence. So if I'm not explaining the return on violence correctly, again, it's just the idea that you can be able to extract resources with violence, and then the risk reward on that. And so that to me is the main theme of the book, and is the easiest to follow throughout history, but it has also never been explained with any real kind of logic, where you're looking at a business case for invading another country and you could say we can get their gold, or breaking into someone's home. And then you look at the technology advances for defense and offense, being able to protect yourself with a gun, I think was a big one. And just kind of look through that lens through history. And you can see that over the last, let's say 5,000 years, that it's been trending towards personal or individual ability to protect yourself. The return on violence has been being removed. And so you can think about, being a knight or being a samurai warrior. You'd be able to go into a town, you're well armored, you're well trained, and you'd be able to, take advantage of the whole village. Well, with a gun nowadays, you can't do that. An untrained villager has a gun and can protect him or herself. So I guess that'd be the main theme that I picked up from that. And it's very exciting to think about where we're at in terms of that, because Bitcoin just really changes that return on violence, and just totally changes that, where there's no way that you can know how much somebody has, but also chances are we'll never be able to get it from them. So that's a very, very powerful thing to move forward on. Again, if you start going through the examples of throughout history, what if Germany didn't have the ability to get gold from the Jews or invade France? So that to me is the main theme.
Yeah, nice. And actually, I at the beginning, I was going to, for people who haven't read the book, I was going to give the author's synopsis of the theme of this book, just so we have an overarching umbrella of what this what the book was kind of about. So, Chris, I'll hit you next, but I'm going to read this first. And so the authors say, the theme of this book is the new revolution of power, which is liberating individuals at the expense of the 20th century nation state. Innovations that alter the logic of violence in unprecedented ways are transforming the boundaries within which the future must lie. If our deductions are correct, you stand at the threshold of the most sweeping revolution in history. Faster than all but a few now imagine, microprocessing will subvert and destroy the nation state, creating new forms of social organization in the process. This will be far from an easy transformation. Our desire is to help you take advantage of the opportunities of the new age and avoid being destroyed by its impact. If only half of what we expect to see happens, you face change of a magnitude with few precedents in history. Goosebumps, baby. All right, Chris, why don't you give us your take?
Oh man, how am I supposed to follow that up? So I'm Chris Porter. I've heard about Bitcoin in 2013 and was dumb enough to not do anything about it. And then my best friend in 2017 was getting all excited about it and was like, "Oh, dude, you gotta learn about this." And I was like, "I already know," and I had kind of written it off then, and then I got back involved when he was so excited. So it's a little bit about my history, but and he and I have started and stopped podcasts and done some different things, trying to educate people in the space. So for me, reading The Sovereign Individual, it blew my mind, and it kept blowing my mind in different ways. So the first one was that 500-year cycle, just profiling history and looking at these different segments in time. I think of it almost like a generation. So like the hippie generation, and then what came immediately after that was a reaction from the previous generation. Well, the authors really profile 500-year cycles and why each cycle is kind of a reaction, and almost inevitable that the next, that you can predict what the next wave will be based off of what the previous one was. And then the other thing that I think really ties it into the Bitcoin space is this idea of the asymmetric advantage of cryptography. And so that's where I feel like the authors are starting to predict Bitcoin, because they really profiled, why does it matter? So, if you build a brick wall around your house, it might take you a month to build it, but it might take an attacker only a few hours to destroy it. Well, all of a sudden now with Bitcoin and with cryptography, there's the tables have turned, right? So somebody can cryptographically, protect their hard drive, and now it takes someone, just eons in order to try and crack that. And so now the scale of violence has really shifted, and for that individual, they can protect themselves against potentially nation states.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, yo, what's up? All right. I'm Guy Swan, the guy who's read more about Bitcoin than anybody else and Bitcoiner class of 2011. And
Jesus,
it's been a crazy ride. And good Lord, this book. Listen to Bitcoin Audible. What's up? Yep, do that. But this book did such a good job of articulating a framework to just look at all of history. And I think one thing that it did particularly well was to look back prior to the nation state, with an objective lens, to not take like our political baggage of like what we think of as like loyalty to the state and like politicians and like bureaucracy, like what we think of as normal today. And because I feel like I never really got that, even not learning what I feel like were the important things in school. Regardless, just looking back in history, I feel like we so often look at it through a lens of like, this is what we think of as important. So this is clearly, that's what we need to look for 1,000 years ago, like they thought of it through the lens kind of a nation state, and they didn't. And like some of the explanations of like kind of feudal setups and like how, chivalry was like the ultimate, like, and replacing things that we take as dear or like hold as like, you must be true to your country, you can't be treasonous sort of thing. And then comparing it to like, the ideas of chivalry or like something that we might think of as like ridiculous then, but they could just turn around and see what we do as ridiculous, and then to see the whole thing, just like both of y'all brought up, was as a payoff to violence, is that like how we started to be able to accumulate wealth, and then suddenly that meant that we could steal wealth because now we had it. Now suddenly it was here, and then we had to organize against it, and how the scales of basically these systems of networking operated and where their vulnerabilities were. And then just to take that lens and look at the whole like stroke of history was just so cool, because it was more coherent when I first stumbled upon this book than I had ever really had a mental image of history. Like you said, John, was just that it was all disparate stuff. It was just like crap that happened and dates, and you know what I mean? Like wasn't like a map to follow. And I feel like this one does such a good job of giving a map. And one of the coolest things that I took away from this book was how, for like an image to look at what's happening today, was there was a section where he was talking about, it's kind of early on in the book before he really gets into the meat, where he's talking about how it's necessarily the case that the disdain and the loss of faith in the old system precedes our discovery of its replacement. And I feel like that is where we are. We have reached the point today where we know something is changing. We know the old system doesn't work. And he even talked about it like it was going back, like looking at 1,000-year-old examples of how it became like a bloated financial behemoth, like a monolith. And it's like, what could be a better example of exactly what we're dealing with? And it, like you said, it gives a feeling of peace, is that it's like, okay, this has to happen. Like the kind of chaos that we're going through right now is part of the process. Like we have to lose faith in the norm in order for it to go to a better place. And praise to Satoshi that better place has Bitcoin, and we all take a ride there.
Well, man, on that point, one of the reasons why I was so excited to actually cover this book in this, in this way, was because what you meant. You're like, we'll look back on history and we'll see kind of modes of behavior. Take chivalry, as you mentioned, right? And we might think, hey, well, they were, really honorable in that time. Or we may think, hey, they're really weird. Like, why'd they act like that? And we, from our position in the current moment, think, we wouldn't have acted that way. And you can slide in any example, whether it's deplorable behavior or honorable behavior or whatever. We look back on history and just think our assumption is like they were free-thinking individuals who chose to act a certain way, and we judge them based on that, as if we are free-thinking individuals deciding to act a certain way. But what I feel like this book kind of reveals is how insidious the circumstance of the logic of violence and the structures that it creates is in imposing or influencing behavior. And so what that means is that when you have a different structure that emerges from a different logic of violence that is itself a result of the technological dynamic that exists at the time, you're going to get an almost expected set of behaviors as a result of that. And so chivalry was something in this case that emerged as a result of the structural circumstance that was in place as a result of the technological imperatives, basically, that were there at the time. And so I think that's really important, not only as a way to assess history, but also obviously to assess what's happening in our current time, and maybe to kind of check our would-be hubris of thinking that in the current time, we're seeing things clearly. We're always seeing things inside of our current moment. Now, some of us, and I think the Bitcoiners are among them, are probably doing so to a lesser extent. We really try to see things clearly. We try to extract ourselves from the time and circumstance that we're in to establish that clarity. But of course, I think to do that completely is impossible, because we're all, both victims and beneficiaries of this circumstance and the structure that has been created by the dynamics that they detail in this book, which is why it's so interesting and juicy, because it affects almost everything from the social, political, economic, moral, individual, behavioral, all that kind of stuff, which we're going to get into. But I'll pass it on to Sovereign Hodl for an intro.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess I'm the only non here today, so I'll try not to dox myself too much. But I'm in Austin, Texas, and I've been a Bitcoiner since, I guess, 2017. But I had my first touch point with Bitcoin in 2012, and then a couple more touch points in 2013, 2014, which usually is the case for most of us. I first was introduced to the sovereign individual when I was at a Bitcoin conference here in Texas, and ran into Parker Lewis, and one of his colleagues was reading the book, and I started talking to him about my ideas about Bitcoin, why I got into Bitcoin, and he mentioned, "Oh, so you ascribe to the sovereign individual?" And I said, "Sure, that sounds cool." Now I had to read the book, right? But initially when I got into Bitcoin, I came about it through really the liberty movement and trying to find ways to reduce the amount of war in the world. Coming from the military, got out of the military in the 2010s, and I was really just looking for a way to reduce the amount of conflict and war in the world, because I'd seen what the war machine is capable of, and I did not like it, right? So I tried voting. I tried, getting involved in the Ron Paul campaign. I tried a number of things like that, and really couldn't find any answers. But really, when I dug into Bitcoin, I started to see, some of the logic of the disintermediation of violence that is mentioned in the sovereign individual. And so after reading the book, it really just opened my eyes to, a lot of this dynamic that you're talking about has happened throughout history. And it spurred me to read some other books, such as, Hop. Read the Democracy, the God That Failed, and his Private Law Society talks. And it's
Gold.
Really tie into this sovereign individual idea. So yeah, I mean, really the main thing that I got out of the book was just that the disintermediation of violence that is, we have, these different dynamics that are going on in the world. We have this deflationary dynamics. We have these inflationary dynamics with currency. We have, a rising, set of people that are haves and have-nots. And, I think that Bitcoin, as it's mentioned in the book, really is going to give a lot of power to individuals who take control of it, and is going to allow us to disintermediate some of that violence and reduce the state power, because otherwise I just don't see any other way that's possible.
Yeah, nice. Richard James, also the creator of Hard Money Film. What's your take, brother?
Hey, John. Yeah, I think that for me, look, I've had this long-term interest in the Austrian perspective of economics and its critique of central banking. And I think the thinker who's influenced me more than anyone is probably Murray Rothbard, and his analysis of the state and the state's monopoly on violence. And his proposal that humans could operate in a society without a state, without a monopolist on violence, I've found, and Sovereign Holdnot, you mentioned Hopper, he sort of has a similar take on things, that private, be they companies, insurance providers or whatnot, could could provide those protection services, police or military, that the state usually provides. And they put forward the argument that it's really a matter of if enough people believed in this libertarian ideal or this kind of anarcho-capital ideal, we'd be able to put it into place. Whereas the sovereign individual, the reason I find it so fascinating is it puts forward almost the opposite view and says, no, actually you can't, it has this thesis that violence is a natural monopoly. So the state, as problematic as the state is, it's inevitable, because if you have competing private providers of protection from violence, the end result of that is more violence. So they say that, look, the state isn't, not just is the state as a monopolist on violence inevitable, that rewards to violence is the driving force of the course of human history. And so that in some ways is a depressing thing. But then where these two lines of thought intersect is talking about Bitcoin and cryptography and the way that microprocessing will decrease returns to violence, that what we're seeing now is a seismic shift. And for the first time, possibly since the agricultural revolution, we're seeing this change in the dynamic where the returns to violence are decreasing. And that's definitely a cause for us to hope for a better world.
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal point. And when I was reading this, of course, it has to inspire in people the idea of like, well, what is your agency or your free will, right? How subject are you to these like large, slow moving changes in the structure of society based on, as you said, the logic of violence and the ability to, defend as an individual, for example. And, I love the point about libertarianism, because you kind of think that politics is like, which idea is best? How should we structure society? And like, this one wins for this period of time, or this one's not popular, or what have you. But, ultimately it seems, as you said, that the one that on average is the one that predominates is the one that's most effective at kind of maintaining that monopoly on violence. And you could even look at it from the form of the kind of democratic capitalist societies and the more, the socialist or communist societies that might have been seen in a more brutal or negative light in the past. And you might think, well, maybe there's still a small degree of choice, and we pick the right one won there. But as you all know in the book, it outlines why the democratic capitalist form of organization was more effective at basically generating what was required to exact or maintain a monopoly on violence, because it basically had a larger pool of capital to draw from, because the economic structure was more toward capitalism, which generated more wealth, but the democratic structure of governance allowed that wealth to be siphoned off in near limitless amounts, and that could be turned into the mechanisms of power, i.e. military might, etc. And so it really begs the question, to what degree are we just subject to the evolution of technology? Is that kind of the only thing that determines the structure that we have in society, and as a result, the behaviors that each individual kind of acts within them?
I think that actually sums up the book very well. As you're looking back through history and you're understanding what kind of technologies are going to lead to what type of perspectives and what type of actions, we like to believe that we are all morally, just, and we're going to be doing the right thing. But, the game, the dynamics and the risk reward is very much going to always play into that. And when you have the ability to steal, millions of dollars of gold that's just sitting right in front of you and no one will ever notice, a lot of people are going to take that opportunity. Are they going to raise an army and go invade, another country? Maybe not, but I think that's that's where this technology is so important, is because it changes the economic incentives. And, you know, being in business, I've always thought about a return on investment, you know, is how is this going to impact me? What's return on investment going to be? But there's one, you know, I don't want to say one level above it, but one level above it, which is the return on violence. And I think that's something that's always been playing out throughout history. We've just lived in a very peaceful time, at least I have, in the United States, where I've never really had to think about the return on violence and what's the reward and things of that nature. I've always worked in a capitalist economy where I had to trade with somebody else. I've never had to think about, okay, if I train myself to go invade this other area, I can extract more resources, more gold, and things of that nature. So I think, you know, the ability, I think that structure and that technology creates, in a lot of ways, the game that we're playing, or frames the game that we're playing. And for the first time, well, I shouldn't say for the first time ever, but in the last 200 years, you can say that the game has changed, and we have entered a capitalistic society where we're trading with each other a lot more, and we can protect each other's property rights. Well, Bitcoin will take that to the nth degree, where you don't have to have a lot of resources to protect yourself. You might not even have to have a gun, or maybe a gun, but you're going to be able to protect yourself with a lot less resources, because again, you can email this resource or this particular savings technology to anyone in the world. And so it's a game of hopscotch, as opposed to, I can see you have a gold bar, I'm going to take it from you. I can see you have a toy, I'm going to take it from you. I can see you have these resources, we're going to come in and take it from you. And if you start to compare the return on violence compared to other products, other savings technologies, other value assets, you know, you can see that this is just light years above and beyond any other valuable asset, right? Again, almost any other asset, somebody's home, you can just break into their home and potentially take it from them, depending on the laws of that area. And so that's really is going to change, and is changing that dynamic. And I think we've seen that dynamic change because of just property rights in the United States. But, you know, moving forward, where you don't need a government to take care of your property rights, and you don't need a police force to necessarily do that, it becomes much more on the individual level, the sovereign individual. And then you can see that changing the game and making the world a lot more peaceful for a lot less of an expense.
Yeah, I'm going to read this short passage from the book, just so that anyone who's been listening so far that hasn't really been following along with the kind of genesis or a good example of the thesis of this book, I'm going to read a passage, and it's this: farming. So when we went from hunter-gatherers to agriculture and farming created stationary capital on an extensive scale, raising the payoff from violence and dramatically increasing the challenge of protecting assets. Farming made both crime and government paying propositions for the first time. So this is a very simple kind of example of the thesis of this book. That is, when the technology of agriculture created the ability for surplus, then you have the problem of, how do I protect my surplus, whether it be in the form of money or other goods, etc. And then the person who has that surplus then has a need for the protection. And that brings in the element of a protector, whether that be government. And that also brings in the element of crime, as in there's something to steal. So that's what the thesis of this book is getting at, is that process keeps playing out on different scales as a result of the evolution of technology. I just wanted to get that in there for anyone who wasn't really getting the thesis of the book yet.
Yeah, and they say something like,
You want to jump in?
Government is a protection service, but it's also almost by definition a protection racket. So, okay, perhaps it provides a necessary service, but it almost inevitably charges way too much for the service that it provides, that it would never, if it had to compete on a free market, it would never be able to compete.
No, yeah, absolutely. And what's funny about that is, kind of back to the question prior, was that you were talking about how it seems like we're just totally dependent on technology. Like, that is actually something that I pretty strongly got from the book. And what's funny is that, like, as somebody who like went through a big shift from being like kind of I guess I was like, my political persuasion was all over the place for a little while there, but I did have a very nationalistic, like love the flag sort of thing going on in high school. And I went through a huge political shift and like kind of became a stark libertarian at the end of college and shortly thereafter. And that was kind of my lens for a long time, was that just like we keep choosing the wrong political thing, that, you know, like that here's one that's good and here's one that sucks. And, you know, when you think about the incentives, it kind of fits, you know, like it seems like it's right that the incentives would be far better in a libertarian society. But when you turn that around and think about the feasibility of it in an environment where it just pays so much to be violent, you realize that it is genuinely a technological problem of how do you change that payoff? How do you change how much someone can get from being a terrible person? And what's beautiful about Bitcoin is that that's kind of at the heart of how the whole thing works. And when you start applying that to the whole world, we'll do that in just a second, but just think about like the internals of like the game theory and the thinking to see the world so clearly, to be able to make something like Bitcoin is to literally turn someone's desire to cheat or desire to profit and earn into a force for cooperation. Like that is how the mining and incentive structure of Bitcoin works, is that you are rewarded for playing along. You are punished for trying to go against. And I always thought that was one of the most fascinating things about like the Bitcoin game theory. And it truly does, like when you start to turn around and realize that when you can when you can secure property and value in a way that's completely at the discretion of the owner, that they are just truly 100% the one in control of it. And that doesn't mean that you can't beat them over the head and be like, give it to me. But just the fact that there is no authority, there is no institution that says, yes, if you need it, we'll give it to you, but that they are the owner, that is something unique in the world. And that's kind of crazy to think about, that it really isn't something that we have in any other space. You mentioned that we suck at going back in history and standing in someone else's shoes. You know, we always see it from our mental default, our values, our political system, blah, blah, blah. You know, we look back 1,000 years in history and we're just miserable at standing in their shoes and their worldview and saying, what does it look like over there? But that Bitcoiners do this a little bit. I think that's actually part because the only way to see the revolutionary potential of Bitcoin is to actually step out of like the normal Overton window of the world today. It's like you kind of have to step away from it and look at it as like a whole thing. And you have to kind of recognize that dynamic of power and violence. And then you're like, wow, Bitcoin really does change this. But if you stay within it, Bitcoin's just an app, you know? It's just a thing on your phone that you could use, but I could use my bank, you know, like without that framework, which makes it a huge barrier to understanding Bitcoin, I feel like. But without that framework, you just really can't see what really makes it different. And I feel like this book does such a good job of laying out the framework. And then if you take that and, you know, put it on like a pair of glasses and look at Bitcoin, you're like, holy shit, this is going to change everything.
Well, I have to use this quote because of what the analogy that you just used. But they say in the book, the sovereign individuals have undergone the political equivalent of laser surgery. They will be seeing 2020.
That was a good one. And on that seeing 2020, I think, you know, I like to look at it through the inevitability of this happening. And I think back to Guy's point, if you're looking at it as an app, and if you're looking at it compared to PayPal, and if you're looking at it compared to these newer technologies that are relatively new within the last 20, 30 years, maybe, really in the last 5 years or 10 years that we've had these apps to be able to do these things, then you might not understand it. But if you go back 20 years and you go through the last recession and the last money printing, and you start to look at that, all right, it makes a little bit more sense. But if you go back 5,000 years and start to ask questions about what if, different social groups had this technology and had this power, how would that have changed the economic of violence? And would that particular group of people started that war to take those resources away from someone? And so the longer timeline that you look back on, the clearer it becomes that this, at least to me, is inevitable just from that standpoint, as well as taking a monetary understanding of that as well, where almost all fiat currencies fail. And so you have something that, is completely changing the return on of violence and return on investment of that violence, which, you start to ask the question, like, what if there was no reward to violence anymore? If during all these wars, what if they actually got nothing from it? Would you have Columbus? I mean, this is probably a knock on this, but like he wouldn't have crossed the ocean to go find the Aztecs and kill them and take their gold. If they were able to protect their resources, it would have never happened. And that, and you can think about that for a lot of different things like World War I and World War II. I mean, Hitler, I don't think would have come to power if you couldn't have been able to go and get the gold from France. That's one of the first things he did. He went and got all the precious, liquid assets, gold being the most obvious one. And I believe there's a book called The Gold Wars that kind of outlines this a little bit. But having studied history, it was always interesting to me that they never talk about how Germany went from, a destitute country, in debt to a global industrial might within, I think it was like 10 years, short amount of time, to being able to almost take over the entire world. And I think the money aspect, or being able to get that monetary good, gold, is a big equation in that. And so I think it becomes much more obvious and much more inevitable the further back you go. And that's why the sovereign individual is so interesting, because it goes back, arches back through, potentially 10,000 years. I mean, you could see it as small little tribes on the savannah or something along those lines. If you can protect your resources more effectively, you can save and you can plan for the future. And that to me is probably one of the more exciting things about the book, is that it just shows the inevitability of this technology as long as it continues to make blocks every 10 minutes.
Yeah, I like how the book outlined, the juxtaposition of world powers with the USSR in the 80s and the United States, and just the difference between socialism and democracy. And one of the things that stood out for me in the book was that the authors really didn't hold back on criticizing democracy, and they essentially said that the main reason that the Soviet Union fell and the United States grew is because democracy was just a more efficient version of socialism, essentially, that they were cousins, right? And they talk a lot about, the power of nation states to gain this, to grow, and a lot of it comes from, seigniorage, the power to tax, and the power to plunder. And I think that Bitcoin and, digital currency, as they call it in the book, really turns that on its head. And so, I mean, that for me is like the main linchpin for the ability to have these decentralized societies that are talked about in the book, and the ability to have sovereignty.
Yeah, one of the lines in the book is, it says, for the first time in history, mega political conditions will allow the ablest investors and entrepreneurs, rather than the specialists in violence, ultimate control over capital, which gets to both your points that you were making there. And, because as everyone's been saying, the best paying proposition previously wanted to accumulate capital, the most efficient means of doing so was actually to go and take it, if you had the power to do so. Whereas now that dynamic has changed dramatically. And, all of this gets to the point of, another quote from the book is, collapse is what happens when a centralized control system is no longer worth what it costs. And that's what I think Bitcoin, and to a lesser extent, the cyber economy, as it were, is doing. It's basically implicitly saying, wait, what am I paying for again? Like, wait, what is the value of the services you're providing me? State, nation, state, country, whatever. And as people's behavior just kind of intuitively and automatically changes to adapt to the different incentive structure that the cyber economy provides, and they're becoming, they just wake up one day and say, oh, I could live anywhere and work and derive income, or I could, I can protect my own wealth via something like Bitcoin, or I could do this, I could do that. All that frames the question, wait, why am I paying 40% to the state? Why? What they decide is, I'm paying way too much for what I'm getting. And that's a big thesis of the book as well, is that the state was a paying proposition for a while. It made sense. It delivered, a certain degree of value to the people who accepted that proposition. Now, because of the changing technological dynamic, it's not anymore. And more people are waking up to that, and they're adjusting their behavior accordingly.
Well, and to carry on with that point, the authors mentioned that the government will start to have to compete with other people for the services that the government currently offers. So in my head, I think of, so Bitcoin solves the tragedy of the commons, right? And so if you have a road, right now the governments build our roads. But if you could pay, fractions of a penny every time you used a road, or fraction, 1 Satoshi to walk on the sidewalk, you could start having private institutions offer goods and services that the government's currently offering.
And that I just had a moment where it kind of clicked for me, and that tragedy of the commons that I think is happening a lot where our technology companies are. So the Googles, the YouTubes of the world, where imagine not just the sidewalk, but you using someone builds the infrastructure for the YouTube of the future, and you're paying 1 Satoshi per video for those type of things. And same thing with Facebook. We are the product being sold to advertisers, but Bitcoin can change that. And I think that removes the tragedy of commons. And obviously the authors wrote this, I think, in 1997. So they weren't aware of things like Google and YouTube. But I think that would be an extension of that example that you mentioned, Chris.
And I think one fascinating thing in this book, it's also kind of something that's just in the whole cypherpunk mailing list. It's also in, which I haven't finished, I actually stopped right in the middle of Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave to go back and try to tackle this one again before we did the show. It's like present throughout all of this. And like the Third Wave was even back, like that was in like 81 or something, if I'm not mistaken. But throughout this like whole 2-decade period where people were slowly realizing how much, microprocessing, as it's usually referred to then, was going to change the world, almost invariably, like the people who really saw its potential will just talk about independent digital money as if it was already a thing. Like they're just like, this is clearly going to be here. No idea what the hell it's going to look like, but it's going to be there. And when that is there and a government is literally not in charge of it, it's going to change everything. And the cypherpunks talked about this. They were trying to build it for 15 years, like 20 years. Like they just kept iterating and iterating and iterating. But the sovereign individual, like, truly just takes this as like a complete given. And I just love how they talk about it. And this is, this whole decade before Bitcoin existed. Like they don't really know if they can solve that problem, but he's just like, yeah, somebody's going to solve it. It's just going to happen. And this is what the world will look like after that. And it's so funny to be on the same time span. Like we're like almost the same number of years after Bitcoin as this was written before Bitcoin. Like we're like getting like right there. And it's so funny to see that and the social networks and kind of the breaking up of that joint narrative of the world, and moving into the online space, and then watching everybody's different ways of thinking about the world suddenly clash without this news as their intermediary. Like everybody's just like bumping into each other, and it's like, holy crap, we're a lot different, and I might hate you for a bunch of stupid reasons. But as more and more of our world goes digital, as more of our value in particular goes digital, the less violence will be the director of the world, because it's just not. And, when I'm arguing with somebody in the digital space, like, violence isn't what determines how things move forward. It is slowly becoming less and less relevant. We are clearly moving to something that is global. We are clearly moving to something where it's just obviously so different, but it's insane to be in the middle of it. It's absolutely insane to just be in the middle of this and know how big of a shift we truly are going through. Just the whole basis, like the book opens on the fact that, like, when you're in the middle of it, it's funny that nobody ever sees it. And that's what I feel like. I feel like, holy shit, we are living through the absolute most insane time with the most insane level of change that is potentially for anybody alive today. And so many people just like have no idea that it's happening. It's just like it's not even on their radar. And just, I don't know, the whole
Or
framing
even
of
worse,
this book is
you're
amazing.
screaming at the top of your lungs to pay attention and no one
Yeah.
does. There's the other aspect where you're just like, no, here, I'll spend all day with you. Here's the book. I'll give you the book. I'll give you the book, and then no follow-up questions. You're just like, okay, all right, I guess they'll spend $200 or something.
Yeah, just to pick up on that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Richard. Go ahead.
To pick up on that point where you're talking about how these authors predict independent cryptographic money like 10 years before Bitcoin came around. They have this section where they talk about the death of seigniorage, like the end of this era where governments are able to rent seek and make profit by having control of the money supply. And what I find amazing is that not only do they predict the emergence of this independent cyber money, they also pick up on Bitcoin's main value proposition 10 years before Bitcoin even existed. So they say, governments will not only lose their power to tax, they're also destined to lose the power of compulsion over money. This new digital gold standard will be impossible to counterfeit. Like, they're talking about a digital gold standard. So they're not getting distracted by changes in payment systems or whatever. Like, they're picking, so that's what I find amazing is, it took us 10 years of arguing about Bitcoin to get to this point where we understand what Bitcoin's proposition is. And they'd already figured that out 10 years before it even existed.
Yeah, that's hilarious to think about. Like, if you explain the block size trade-offs to them in 20 minutes, they'd be like, oh yeah, keep that shit small. Like, they just be like, oh no, duh, absolutely.
Yeah, just to add to that section on cyber cash, they say this new digital form of money is destined to play a pivotal role in cyber commerce. It will consist of encrypted sequences of multi-hundred-digit prime numbers, unique, anonymous, and verifiable. This money will accommodate the largest transactions. It will also be divisible into the tiniest fraction of value. It'll be tradable at a keystroke in a multi-trillion-dollar wholesale market without borders. I mean, that's crazy as fuck.
It's ridiculous. Like, the book is so characteristic of stuff like that, but that passage in particular, I'm sure, stood out to all of us. But what I find funny is that, like, they were just like, yeah, of course that's going to be a thing. Whereas, like, I think a lot of us, at least in the conversations I've had, like, we were a bit, wowed by the fact that Bitcoin was able to kind of sneak in the back door and get its footing, and get enough of a footing so that it wasn't easily, squashed in the early days. And I'm almost surprised they didn't spend any time on that, thinking like, well, if it is such a game changer in terms of the state's power dynamic, like, they didn't explore at all what the state's response might be to it in terms of trying to squash it or sideline or what have you. Now, maybe that's just because they just knew that there's no stopping the tide and this was going to happen by hook or by crook. But I just, that made me smile when they didn't devote any time to that portion of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's probably, you think about it from the perspective of 1997, it's probably too far removed. Like, he's looking past that period to when it exists, and you're right, they didn't take the time to actually wonder about how it might come about. But I think that was the job of the cypherpunks, right? Like, that's what they were doing every day, and they still hadn't figured it out or, like, gotten the the whole architecture together. So it's kind of fascinating too that it's kind of like a limit security, like the way Bitcoin works is one that did require a very long and vulnerable maturation phase to actually get to where it was secure at a scale that is meaningful to nation states. But that as it continues to grow, it literally will just, all the value will be soaked up into it. Yeah, it's crazy.
This out there. Let me put this out there because I think this is one of the interesting parts of the thesis of this book. And it says that the growing importance of technology in shaping the logic of violence has led to an acceleration of history, leaving each successive transition with less adaptive time than ever before. So what it's suggesting is that we've been exploring how technology kind of always determines the mega political circumstance, but that the technology is becoming, with each sequential kind of large change, even more important and impactful in shaping the structure of the prevailing circumstance. And so, as the quote suggests, it says, leaving less adaptive time than ever before. One of the things that first comes to my mind when I think of something like that, and I agree with that assessment, is that when you have less time to adapt to something, the change can be far more disruptive or chaotic. And it does obviously explore that in the book from the both social, political, moral, and economic side of things. I'm wondering if you guys have any big takeaways from that.
On that point, it's interesting to think about that because, the older I get, the more I realize that you just kind of have to have the new come in and the old leave type of mentality, where it's hard to change people that are already ingrained in their beliefs and kind of ideas, and it's just hard to change those, right? And I think for the first time ever, we're having something move so quickly that we have to be adaptable within our own generation's paradigm. So, when a sword came along, it slowly made its way throughout society over generations. And I think that's an interesting point, that this is going to happen so fast that we have to be conscious and adaptable and have a growth mindset and be willing to learn and dive into the rabbit hole.
Yeah, the amount of change, it's funny because people, and I think this may be more of it, like it will move in really big shifts because people are very slow to change, like how they think about a thing. And when things are changing so rapidly, it's easy to kind of accept or live with a small contradiction. So it's like, okay, my worldview doesn't quite fit, but I'll just kind of like erase this part or just like try to isolate it over here and not like include it in my worldview. And we'll just kind of keep doing that. But that slowly the stuff that's pushed under the rug and is trying to be ignored just becomes so massive, it just becomes this giant thing that's living in the house with you all the time until the pressure is so great that everybody just freaks out and you have this like kind of conscious shift in society. And obviously it gets attached to riots and institutions fail, bankruptcies, like it ends up being kind of the culmination of so much that kind of brews all at the same time. And that, but that it's inevitable, like we're going through a transition and it's kind of the nature, I guess kind of the point that I wanted to lead to was that I don't know if, are we going to reach a point where this slows down at all? Like it feels like as every iteration, like, are we just kind of lagging behind permanently at this point? Because technology is changing so fast and the new iterations of technology are speeding up the previous scale or the previous like acceleration of being able to test new things or come up with new ideas or talk and share current ideas. It's moving so fast that I can't decide if we're just in an exponential curve that just goes to, and kind of the imagination of the authors in this book. They just kind of say, like, you know, post year 2000, we just don't really know what the hell the world's going to look like. It's just obvious it's going to be hugely different. And there are so many people who have given so many, like, laying out the trends. Danny Hillis does this really great. He has a video on YouTube where he goes back kind of 1 billion years, and he just looks at this as this giant trend of change that's happening and the acceleration of change. And I just can't decide if we're going to, like, if this is going to be an S curve and we're going to get like a break for a century or two before moving into some other wave, or does this ever end? I don't know. Do we ever catch up as people to figuring out what the hell the world is? Or are we just kind of just being drugged behind this thing, like tied ropes around our ankles, and we're just like along for the ride?
Yeah, I think our evolutionary hindbrains are having trouble catching up. I think you see that with a lot of the cognitive dissonance in the world today. I mean, we went from, you know, hunter-gatherer tribes that were, you know, very pressed for familial genetics and ensuring that, you know, our offspring survived, to, you know, being in larger groups that were part of Dunbar's number, you know, a little less than 150 or so.
Yeah.
Being, you know, nation states. And, you know, that's still, we still have that kind of selfish gene mentality where, you know, a lot of the nation state programming is to, you know, fight for your team, right? And fight for your genetics kind of thing. And I think that we'll continue to see, you know, some cognitive dissonance on that into the future. But, you know, with each new generation, I think they're going to adapt to that a little bit differently, right?
Well, and to talk to your point a little bit more, John, I think the alignment of incentives. So after reading the book, it just made me constantly see current events, past events through the lens of the incentive structure. And so one of the points the book brings up is Coase's law, which I'd never heard of before. It states that companies expand until the cost of performing a transaction inside the firm exceeds the cost of performing it outside. And so I think what that means is that we're going to see large companies be broken up into smaller and smaller companies, because the cost of doing business with many intermediaries or with many small individuals is going to be less, because, you know, because of communication tools, because of technology. And so, yeah, just I look at the incentive structure of why does it make sense to have such a large company that ends up outsourcing things? Why don't you just go direct to that person that they're outsourcing the work to?
Yeah, that's one of the aspects I found interesting about the book, because they did suggest that, you know, large kind of behemoth organizational structures would tend to decentralize and disintegrate for the reason that you just articulated, which I think you could make a case has been happening in certain contexts. And maybe where we're at now is maybe the zenith of the old mega political momentum. But both in the political category, and if you look at like the big tech companies, right, they've gotten so big rather than disintegrate over the intervening 20 years. Do you guys have any kind of insights on why you think that is the case?
I actually just read a piece on the show like a week or two ago called, it was Shelling Points, Network Effects, and Lindy. And it's just talking about like communication protocols, languages, like one of the great examples, and I always love this one, was VHS and Betamax, you know, a DVD or a Blu-ray and HD DVD, like that sort of thing, like those standards competitions in history, and why some of them, like all these network giants, Google, Facebook, Twitter, like the social media things, the reason they end up seeming like monopolies is because communication protocols don't actually follow the same market dynamics as a normal good or product would. Like you would think, like in a normal market, it's like, okay, well, I have a product, you have a product, and they compete, and like things are free flowing, and you want open competition. And this is also true when you're trying to find a communication protocol to like lock in on. But necessarily the market is actually a consequence of having a communication protocol. You have to be using the same means of communication. You have to be using the same way to connect to each other and speaking with the same language and the same rules in order to establish a market for competition. And therein lies a reason why so many of these networks become monopolistic. But to Chris's point, is that they still are actually succumbing to the fact that they're getting so big and so bloated that they're not sustainable. They grow so fast and they get that monopoly on these networks, but as centralized companies, they can't keep up, and you can see it. Like, there are cracks all over the place. Even with trying to have a very open working environment, and like Google's like 80-20 rule of you work on whatever the hell you want to work on sort of thing, even trying to make it as quote unquote less centralized as possible, but still being a single business institution, they're still getting super bloated. Like the technical debt in some of these companies now that need teams of hundreds of engineers just to make sure it still works with the rest of the crap that they're making. Ultimately, the end of that article was just talking about how open source, like, moves slower and more gradually, but in the end, it will always end up with the better, more sustainable product. And that slowly and surely, like, we'll step through all of these communication protocols or improvements in these communication protocols until we find a way to sustain them in an open source manner. And I truly think, if you kind of look at the trends of the digital world, I think that's pretty much true. I think that's a fair assessment, that you look more and more into the future, we'll find the open source alternative, and it's the only thing that makes sense for that communication layer.
And I've got a thought on that. You know, I agree. I think going kind of what we were talking about earlier, Chris, is this kind of, you know, the tragedy of the commons. And right now the internet has created a lot of kind of tragedy of the commons combined with this freemium model. In other words, that like these big organizations, Facebook, Google, YouTube, they provide the product for free, where it'd be really annoying or difficult for the individual to create that and compete. They hook you in, and then they charge you something on the back end, or upsell you, or sell your eyeballs to an advertising platform. And I think that's where the, you know, Nick Szabo's micropayments kind of model really comes in, because how much better would your viewing experience be if it was aligned with what you actually wanted to see and could pay for in a not expensive way, as opposed to you're throwing a middleman in there for advertising. And that's kind of what excites me the most, because I'm just going to speak for myself, is like I get distracted more than I ever want to with Facebook and Instagram. And what if there was a product that was built and we were paying for that was much better aligned? And it's similar with YouTube, with a lot of the cancel culture that's going on right now. I mean, I love to watch you guys, Guy, I love to watch your stuff on, you know, podcasts and whatnot. And I'd love to, you know, pay for a little, like, be a better aligned with it, where, you know, the content that I'm watching is just much more aligned. And, you know, obviously I donate, but because it's great stuff. But the thing is that you want to align those interests. And that's kind of where I see the gap being, as kind of John was mentioning earlier. And you can see that there's a great TED talk called the Freemium Model. And a lot of organizations, tech organizations, give something away for free. Box.com, Dropbox. I mean, it's just a laundry list of tech companies that kind of get you hooked, get in the platform, get you on, and then charge to upsell you. Spotify is another example. And then, or advertise, or even worse, sell your data. So I think that's going to be the most exciting thing. And then hopefully you'll get away from this kind of news clickbaity culture to something that's like, oh, let me share this, it'll go much more viral. And as it goes more viral, it's obviously adding a lot of value. And people are becoming a lot more in-depth, rather than trying to become Instagram models or whatever the heck it is. And it was, here's an example that's coming top of my head. It was impossible to find out inflation. You know, trying to understand the total addressable market of Bitcoin, you could not even find definitions of inflation, then get data on it. I mean, now you've got a lot of that data, because I've spent years in this space, because it's just a very interesting question. But earlier on, it was almost impossible. And I think that's a great example of a need that we all, I think, had, that I couldn't find answers to. And so that's kind of what I see Bitcoin being able to do, to create a more perfect marketplace. But most importantly, it just aligns the interests, ideally where consumer and the producer, and there's no middleman and there's no friction, because right now it's the friction. People are like, I want that app for free, I want that product for free. But imagine paying 10 cents and you get 100 times better product that scales out to the globe. So I think that's what Bitcoin and micropayments will allow to have happen in our current model, and not even 100 years from now, and whatever crazy self-driving cars we're going to be in. Hopefully we'll live 100 years. That's the timeline.
But so you're hitting on the drum that I keep, from reading this book. It's that alignment of incentives, right? And so I just constantly keep going back to incentives and what are the incentives. And I can't remember if they mentioned this or not, but the principal agent problem of, you put a CEO in charge of a company, and now their incentive structure is not for the user, it's for the stockholders, it's for their employees. And so again, Bitcoin fixes this, right? But like the incentive structure and the principal agent problem is one that I think highlights the incentive structure and why companies continue to grow beyond the scale at which they should. And then, Facebook initially solved a problem, right? It helped people. It was actually built to solve users' needs. And then the book talks about this, where there's this tipping point where the organization is no longer serving its users; it's almost serving its own ability to perpetuate itself. And so I'll be curious to see how how Bitcoin inside organizations, or the one I think of as Aragon. Say what you want about Ethereum, but Aragon can maybe start to solve that incentive structure and the alignment of incentives.
And just for the audience's definition, the principal agent problem, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, is where you have a bureaucracy or an organization that gets so big where the individual interest within that unit is not to serve the client, but to serve their own individual interests. And you can usually think about that as in a larger organization. You're not necessarily focused on the client's needs. You're focused on getting promoted and playing the politics within that organization. And so that's the biggest challenge within an organization, which can also be potentially solved by Bitcoin, where you can pay people per idea and whatnot. It just aligns the interest much more effectively. So that's is that correct, Chris?
Yeah, right on.
Two things on that topic that are great to read just about that framing right there. Is one is called For Fun and For Profit, and it's about the history of the open source movement. And then the other one is What's Really Driving the Cryptocurrency Phenomenon. And it's really about that contest between satisfying the management hierarchy versus the new culture that existed in like the era of microprocessing, about the internet and everything, this open source culture of like wanting to just go at and solve the problem as quickly and as succinctly as they could solve it, as that these two basic classes essentially found themselves at odds with each other. And the institution was no longer there the engineers felt like they should be doing something than what the institution thought that they should be doing. And that divergence has grown, and that open source culture has fed on itself because it's one that's collectively just shares everything. And it's exploded in the last couple of decades in particular. And Bitcoin, just that alone, just having an open, independent money, I think itself can double down that explosion. The thing we've been talking about is the acceleration of technology, that the new technology will help speed up the iterations of the last. And Bitcoin's a perfect example. Open source, the one thing that open source always sucked at was organizing, getting funds, paying for things. And now we have an entirely new technology, an entirely new ecosystem, and a deflationary one at that, where just staying in the space and devoting yourself to it could have huge profit potential just in savings, like down the road. It's one of those things that I feel like Bitcoin feeds on this exact like contest between those two, in a major way.
Yeah. On Marty Bent's podcast the other day, Ethan Vera was talking about something similar to that with regards to just open source development and, the incentives of the developers and, really producing products that solve the needs of the people that are coming to, develop those products. And, Alvin Toffler talked about prosumers and consumers. And, in the future, we'd have more prosumer oriented societies where individuals who wanted to create something could be involved in the production process. And in the Sovereign Individual, they talk a little bit about federal production lines run by independent contractors. And I just thought that was really interesting. They didn't have any sense of 3D printing at that time, but they're in Marty Bent's podcast the other day. Ethan was talking about just how there's a big divergence between the physical world and the software world when it comes to open source development and that type of a collaboration in a kind of distributed environment. And I think that with Bitcoin, that gives us a common language where independent contractors can come together and work on projects like that. And with 3D printing, I think it's something that we'll see a lot more of. I mean, especially in the time of COVID, right? Where also in the book, they talk a little bit about just-in-time inventory and how technology is creating an environment where, having just-in-time inventory is beneficial to these organizations. But as we can see with COVID and with the supply chain disruptions that we've had recently, that has become a huge issue.
Yeah. Guys, we're going to start winding it down soon. I want to touch on a few additional things, but I have a feeling my connection has been horrible. So I'm going to have to apologize for how spotty that's been. I dropped out a few minutes ago. But anyways, so all good points. But I want to touch on something that Guy was referring to in terms of, are we always doomed to just be dragged along by this thing? Are we always kind of like trying to catch up to the event horizon? And as a result, like, is it just something we have to accept that the people who see these changes earlier will be the ones to adapt, capitalize, and thrive, and the people who don't see it, refuse to see it, don't have the capability, means, or circumstance to adapt, they are going to be subject to it? Because in the book, they talk about these changes. And when you assess history, you delineate certain times and certain events. And, they talk about the collapse of one system in favor of the nation state. They're talking about the collapse of the nation state in favor of this decentralized sovereign individual model. But will people notice it, or will you just wake up one day and you'll be in another one? Kind of like the way fashion works. We look back at the 80s and we're like, holy fuck, people look ridiculous. But there was never like a point at which we can, like, it wasn't like, oh, 96, that changed. It just, you get all these tiny incremental changes over time until you wind up in a completely different situation. And the reason why I think that is relevant is because today, as they say, political shifts, we're seeing the manifestations of the people who are subject to the more negative aspects of this coming change. I think we talk about this as Bitcoiners. We see where this is going. And on the other side of it, we're excited about what's going to be there. A more peaceful, a more prosperous society, better forms of cooperation, more efficient, more productive, etc. But a big group of people are experiencing this change and this transition in a very negative way. And I'm going to read a couple passages from the book. Then I'll open it up to a discussion about the kind of social and political negative effects of this larger change, and if there's anything that can be done about it. So for one, it goes, for this reason, it's to be expected that one or more nation states will undertake covert action to subvert the appeal of transients. And I had to say this quote because someone brought up COVID. Travel could be effectively discouraged by biological warfare, such as the outbreak of a deadly epidemic, this could not only discourage the desire to travel, it could also give jurisdictions throughout the globe an excuse to seal their borders and limit immigration. I'm not suggesting that's the case with COVID, but these are the types of considerations that we make. It also says the political judgments seem less a response to the real world than a pseudo-reality that the general public has constructed about phenomena beyond their direct knowledge. In the information age, it will be much less important that governments be large and powerful than it be honest. And just one about the social issues. Megapolitical transitions are never popular because they antiquate painstakingly acquired intellectual capital and confound established moral imperatives. They are not undertaken by popular demand, but in response to changes in the external conditions that alter the logic of violence in the local setting. Major transitions always involve a cultural revolution and usually entail clashes between adherents of the old and new values. So I think there's plenty examples of in our world today of, you know, the manifestations of this anxiety that's induced from this mega political change. And I just wanted to get you know, your takes on all of that.
I think that one of the theses of the book is that history speeds up like over time. Like if you look at the agricultural revolution played out over millennia, and then you've got the feudal revolution, the industrial revolution over centuries, and now with this information revolution, it's actually happening fast enough that an individual who can predict the future, or at least predict the trends in which we're heading, can set themselves up to profit from that within their own lifetime. So I think to your point before, it is possible for what they call these people, these sovereign individuals, to set yourself up to benefit from these changes. But that then the other side of that coin is that generally people are conservative. That's the point they make, so that you are going to have a fallout from this. A lot of the changes they predict aren't necessarily good. They say that one thing they predict is an increase in inequality, that we're going to see an amplification of these winner-take-all effects. And they make parallels to the fall of the Roman Empire, the transition to feudalism and things like that. So yeah, according to their thesis, this kind of social unrest and this reaction is playing out almost as they predicted.
Yeah, if the three different like little segments that you had just read were written in present tense, I could totally believe somebody was just trying to explain what the hell is going on today.
Yeah, I agree, and that's part of the crazy prescience of the book. But here's another passage. The growing tribalization and marginalization of life have had a stunning effect on discourse and even on thinking. Many people have consequently gotten into the habit of shying away from conclusions that are obviously implied by the facts at their disposal. For these and other reasons, the age of information has not yet become the age of understanding. To the contrary, there has been a sharp drop-off in the rigor of public discourse. To your point, Guy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that couldn't be more true. And, it's kind of and I liken that to the nature of being exposed to ideas and conversations and perspectives that we're used to just being able to pretend don't exist because they're not in our immediate social circles. And they're not part of the overarching narrative that you get from the, 3 television stations that exist. 20, 30, 40 years ago, the narratives were so narrow, like they were together, everybody was on the same page. It was just very easy for people to not be overwhelmed with information and therefore just rest on whether it's a lie or not, fall on a single kind of image for what the world is, a single narrative for the country or the people, whatever the hell it is. And information technology has just took a nuclear bomb to that and thrown so many in the mix all at once. But what's funny is that because you can see the transition if you step back from it, and particularly like with this book, if you kind of look at this from the logic of violence and you just kind of see these huge dynamics, it's so weird to think about, like, yeah, it probably is going to make inequality worse for a long time, maybe even, and it's going to hurt, and it's going to throw so many people like just rugs out from under them, and they're going to smash on the floor like, what the hell just happened? They're not even going to see it coming. And it just kind of feels like technology is moving at such a fast pace, and it's even worse if people aren't even really paying attention to what is changing. They're just kind of getting mad in the moment when things aren't turning out exactly like they thought it would. Like we're literally on this giant rocket, and nobody has a clue where it's going. And a lot of people are fighting over the steering wheel. And there's only like 5 or 6 seats, and basically the Bitcoiners are the ones that got that. There's only a handful of comfortable corners on this thing, and everybody else is literally just duct taped to the outside of it. And and it's just going as blasting as hard as it can go, and we're just here. And it's just kind of crazy that it just feels totally out of our control, and the best we can do is observe it and kind of see its trajectory.
Well, I've got to read one more passage just because of what you just said, but it goes this way. The stimulus to collective violence comes largely from the anxieties people experience when established institutions fall apart. If misery or danger compounds the anxiety, runs the theory, the reaction becomes all the more violent. In Tilley's view, however, violence is not so much a product of, quote, anxiety as it is a far more rational attempt to bully authorities into, quote, meeting their responsibilities, motivated by a, quote, sense of justice denied. I mean, this seems like such a, as we keep saying, modern commentary. You could apply that to what's going on in many cases today, right?
Right. That on that thought, like I think there's a lot of parallels, just too many parallels to the Roman Empire that lasted, I think, about 3,000 years. Richard, brought up, I think it's very interesting that they started debasing their currency. And then, towards the end of the empire, there was the politicians that were buying votes from the people to continue to get more resources. And I think you can see that today where with the handouts and the $600 and, so just a kind of question if that's happening. And they used to call it bread and circuses. You just entertain the people and then you give them free food and you win their votes and you become the politician, you get more resources. Going back to Chris's point, agent versus principal or whatever I forget the exact now. And it's just too perfect, and if you study the Roman Empire, it's falling just like it is right now. And Adam Back had a great tweet where he mentioned, like, it's the fall of the Roman Empire and people are sitting there trying to pick which color politician they want and who's going to ride the Titanic all the way down to the bottom. The Titanic has got a gashing huge hole in it, and people are not even rearranging the deck chairs on top, but they're arguing about how to arrange the deck chairs and who's going to lead, that deck chair. And so I think that to me is a very interesting kind of analogy and thought process. And it's very similar to the Roman Empire falling 3,000 years ago. Again, the same things were happening in terms of a democracy was falling, or a republic that was falling, excuse me. And then the other thing that to add to that thought process is that the Roman Empire was, extremely strong. I mean, it controlled, let's say 90% of the world economy. I don't know if that's accurate, but I'm just throwing that number out there. Now we live in a global society where governments could subvert, the United States government, for example. You think a business, it makes a good return on investment to buy a senator, it makes a good return on investment as a business to do that. Imagine if you're a foreign country, what's the return on investment of buying a politician? And so there's a really great interview by former KGB agent. The title of it on YouTube is Former KGB Agent Yuri Bezmenov Warns America About Socialist Subversion. And so not only do you have what's happening in perfect parallel with the fall of the Roman Empire, but now you add another factor here, which is other governments could subvert a democratic government because it's so easy to buy a politician. The return on investment is just there. Why would you go to war with that country when you can just give $2, $3, $4, $5 million, which is is the cost of an Apache helicopter or whatever the numbers are, and the return on violence is now the return on subversion or buying a politician because it's a democratically elected, government. And so you don't need to go and invade that country, you just buy their democracy. And I think that adds, I don't want to say a cherry on top, but I guess I don't have any other analogy. So it just adds another dynamic, which accelerates this, which might make it worse. Thoughts?
I watched that that video that you're talking about with the KGB agent Yuri Bezmenov, and yeah, I found that really interesting. First of all, because it's from the mid '80s or something, and it's pretty prescient. And he almost makes the point that it's not like the Russians have to deliberately subvert America, that it's almost the Americans are doing it to themselves. And he talks about this generation of people that grew up in the 60s and 70s who are now running the institutions. They have this mindset that it's almost like you forget, you get it so good that you forget how you got there in the first place. Like we almost forget the fact that it's capitalism. It's a process of production and exchange that creates wealth. And wealth is not something that is just falls from the sky. It needs to be created. And so with so much focus on the redistribution of wealth, this capture of the state by its employees, basically, which is another thing that the sovereign individual talks about. It's almost like a crumbling from within as much as is subversion from outside.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to see a lot of backlash to these, forces of decentralization and just the trend that we're headed on and that really, if you want to ensure that you're going to come out ahead on this, and the socialists and the nationalists and the neo-Luddites that are stuck in their positions, they're going to have a really hard time, I think. But there's one quote in the book here that says, "To optimize your lifetime earnings and become a sovereign individual, you will need to become a customer of government protection service rather than a citizen. Instead of paying whatever tax burden is imposed upon you by grasping politicians, you'll be better positioned to prosper in the information age by freeing yourself to negotiate a private tax treaty that obliges you to pay no more for services of government than they're actually worth to you." And I think we're starting to see some cracks in the seams with regards to different jurisdictions that might open up. I mean, I think it was Bermuda the other day that indicated that they were accepting foreigners to come and stay on a work visa for a year during the COVID crisis. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of that. So if you get ahead of that trend, I think you're going to be a little bit better off. But the folks that are really entrenched in their positions that don't want to budge, they're going to have a really hard time, I think.
Yeah, one of the points I'd like to make on that, and that's kind of what I was getting at, 10, 15, 20 minutes ago, is that, and we talked about this before we started the live stream, but will we see a bifurcation as a result of the people that most depend on, I guess, the existing system and will cling to it as much as possible to try to wring from it every last ounce of benefit they can get from it, or perceived benefit, versus the people who will see the writing on the wall and have the ability to extricate themselves from a situation. And I'd love to finish with that discussion about citadels and individual sovereignty and what this book both recommends and what everyone is thinking about it. But one of the things I found fascinating was they did, Blake, I think you referenced this, kind of suggest that wars of the nature of World War I and II and those kind of hot physical wars are a thing of the past, and the future wars will be information wars and things like that, which, that's a pretty lofty assumption or prediction to make. I'm encouraged by it because I'd love for that to be the case, because I think we've all, the narrative of rising power in China, declining power in the US, and the dynamic that's played out when that's been the case in previous times in history, that's probably played on all of our minds to some degree as we look out on the world and assess what's going on. And so, that's a bold prediction. I hope it's accurate. But as I'm thinking about what kind of things the book left out or got wrong, do you think that's one of those things, or do you broadly agree with it?
Sorry, the specifically what? Go ahead. Someone else.
I was just going to say real quickly, I definitely think they underestimated the rise of China and the popularity of socialism for sure. So I think we're going to have a bumpy period for a while.
Well, it's interesting because I, wrote down, I think the sovereign individual is the opposite of 1984. So I think you're going two directions, and there's only two directions. You're going in, full monopoly on violence, and they're going to control and see into, Google Alexa, Google Home, or, whatnot, and they're going to be able to control everything. And I think because now you have the power of the money, and going back to the principal agent problem, you're going to be able to have the alignment of the individual interests going down from, network effects of you want a better search engine or more aligned with your values or aligned with your interests of a search, YouTube, things of that nature, but also even more importantly, the government. And so the sovereign individual to me is the opposite of 1984. And it's interesting to think, I think, at the core root, Bitcoin or sound money and a money that you can't influence is kind of at the principle of that fight. And now it feels like it's been won, hopefully, and it's just going to play out the way the technology would allow that to play out. I don't know if that answered your question, John.
Yeah, I think like on the point of I was thinking about it, particularly like listening through it this time around. Like why didn't they see the potential of, China like growing up? Like what was it about China that really made it stand out in its like transition to this? And how did we end up with this massive the 1984 basically? China's a pretty good example of the huge surveillance state, the social credit system. Like, I mean, it's crazy. And in thinking about it is, China is relatively like, they have not been a wealthy, like market economy for a very long time. And in thinking about like the stages of development and going back to the thesis of the second wave and the third wave, Alvin Toffler's thing, and applying that to the sovereign individual idea, is that China kind of went through their like a highly accelerated pace of their second stage, centralized, build a giant country of a manufacturing plant. Like they went through that phase at an incredibly rapid pace, very late when the third wave technology was already here. But honestly, I think looking at their situation, I think they're just as precarious as the US. I don't really think they're in a much better position overall. And I think Bitcoin is something that really just undermines both of them kind of at their foundation. But one of the most fascinating things about this book that I didn't think about it because I'm always looking at the big picture, and I forget sometimes to narrow it down and go back and look at local and what does that mean at the local level. But one of the things that I thought was fascinating after they broke down how the hierarchy of violence and the scale, more importantly, the scale of violence fails to actually pay what it costs, essentially. Like it doesn't make that profit anymore, is that you'll actually see an explosion in local mafia. Like you'll get the violence won't actually go away, particularly at first. You'll just completely change where it is, and it will all become localized again. Local violence and individual crime and that sort of thing will suddenly be on the rise, and you'll be worried about who your county government is or your county mafia, et cetera, et cetera. It literally just changes the scale. And I'm thinking here, it's like, it's the state and everything's my whole framing is just the state, the nation state. And it's like, oh, well, where does it go? It's just like, where does the water flow after the walls break down from its, central organization hub? And it's crazy to think that, that's going to be a huge part of the transition as we go lower and lower and lower down that violence hierarchy, I guess is a way to put it.
Well, it's interesting to think about that and then citadels, because immediately when you mentioned that, I was like, oh, you're just talking about a citadel. Yeah, and so like, hopefully this time, instead of the gangs, and I'm sure there will be a combination of this, so the people that get in early and get the way these systems are developed, and they'll go quickly into their own little communities and they'll protect themselves and create their citadels, and then there'll be people that want to hang on to the nanny state and just continue that as long as they possibly can, because that's what they were promised. Even though the government has no money left.
It's kind of magical that the Citadel meme aligns so perfectly with this. Like, it really is, like, it's a joke, but it's not a joke.
It ain't a joke at all. That shit's definitely going to happen. I mean, all the more after reading this book. I mean, if you needed any convincing, I think it probably provided that. But I'm going to shut this down now, guys. I got one more question for everybody. I'm going to apologize again for the connection and sound issues, because they've been horrible on my end. But
how dare you?
One thing, I'll change it for next time. God, one thing to your point, and then two passages from the book before my final question. But so one passage from that refers to what you were just talking about, guys. If information systems are designed properly, nation states would merely be able to sabotage or destroy certain sums of digital money, not seize it. The conclusion is that most predictable and vulnerable assets of the rich in the coming information age may be their physical persons, in other words, their lives, which is why we fear Luddite-style terrorism in the coming decades, some of it perhaps covertly encouraged by agents, provocateurs in the employ of nation states. And within that chapter, they go into the kind of the vacuum that may be left over if the nation state were to recede in the protection and hierarchy of violence that it provides. And as you said, into that vacuum, as is the case always, there may slip another provider of somewhere on the hierarchy of violence, and that could be organized crime or what have you. But I think it's also important to remember that the reason why the state's monopoly on violence will recede is because the defensive capabilities of the individual have increased, and that may mean there's less of a vacuum for a new violent agent to slip into. But the two more things. So systems that work most effectively under the widest range of conditions depend for their resilience upon spontaneous order that accommodates novel possibilities. I'm including that just because that's a passage I like. The final passage is this: the commercialization of sovereignty itself depends upon the willingness of hundreds of thousands of sovereign individuals and many millions of others to deploy their assets in the first bank of nowhere in order to secure immunity from direct compulsion. Those among the information elite will certainly be smart enough to recognize a good thing when they see one. And I wrote in my book notes, Bitcoiners. So my question to all of you guys is, what does a sovereign individual do? What is their plan of attack in this circumstance in 2020? What does a sovereign individual look like, and what are they thinking about doing?
I want to say
buying Bitcoin an answer.
Buying Bitcoin.
That better be part of it.
I'll say one thing really quick before I actually answer the question, was that I did not remember anywhere, and somehow I didn't catch it either, but that bank of nowhere was in this book. That was a quote. Dang it.
Yep.
I'd been wondering where the heck I heard bank of nowhere.
It's awesome,
and
right?
Thinking of, like, for a while, like, bank of nowhere, bank of everywhere. What works better for Bitcoin? And I could have sworn I'd heard it somewhere, and it's been bouncing around my head for months and months and months. And you just finally cleared that up for me. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
I'll share real quick. One of the things I'm watching is for second order effects, and just kind of diving in and studying that, because I believe this time there's going to be opportunity, whether it's buying real estate or whether it's buying businesses. So, and the quote that I like from the book is to try and predict the future, we must draw out the implication of events. They're already known, sometimes referred to as second order effects or knock-on effects. Sorry, that was not a quote. That was just my notes from the book.
one thing that I think like applying this framework is that people need to stop thinking of themselves as citizens and start thinking of themselves as shoppers. Shoppers of law, shoppers of jurisdiction, and a unintelligent, uninformed shopper is going to get screwed every time they go in the store. You need to start looking at these things like products. You know, there are some things that if you learn a lot about the product, if you really hunt for reviews, if you really go shopping, you can almost always find something that really like solves a problem. Like, and you should be open to that. We should be open to that. Just like Chris just said, is I think in this period where things are changing so fast and to such a huge effect, like there's going to be a mountain of opportunity. And the last thing we should be doing is letting the chaos and the depression get us apathetic from it, because there's also unbelievable opportunity to see what's moving and get ahead of it, move in the right direction as things are starting to shift. In fact, this is like one of the only quotes I actually had saved. But it's a quote from the book that's a quote from Tom Stoppard. But it says, "The future is disorder. A door like this has cracked open maybe 5 or 6 times since we got up on our hind legs. It is the best possible time to be alive, when almost everything you thought you knew is wrong." And I just thought that was the best sum up. And it's also early in the book, but like that is, I think, how we should look at this. And buy Bitcoin, that too. And listen to Bitcoin Audible.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then
Chris, you got some last words? I know you got to go.
This was awesome. I love getting to talk with other people that maybe are in different bubbles from mine, but this book has impacted me, and it continues to impact me, shifting my thinking. I'll need to revisit it again, probably next year, and then just keep pulling out the things that I can apply to my own life, because the authors are at this really high level, but I think the themes and even tools that they give really allow us to be able to look at things that are happening and make judgments on them and predict the future even.
Totally.
Yeah,
well, thanks for joining us, man. I know you got to duck out, so I appreciate your input.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Later, man.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those books that deserves a re-listen, or reread. I'm a listener these days, but it's one that you can just like every time. Like I'm always catching new things or something that like just seemed to be the middle of a paragraph that might not be important, but that just kind of had his own gold nugget in there. But yeah, this is definitely one I'll be revisiting ever so often.
Yeah.
I think my last word on the book would be that one of the things I find most inspiring about it is this idea that the progress of the information age is like the ultimate in providing equality of opportunity. And as the value of capital transitions away from being physical to being intellectual or digital, it really levels the playing field for anyone in any part of the world with an internet connection to contribute and to monetize their skills. And so we argue a lot about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. And I think we come to the conclusion that equality of outcome is a mirage, and not that it doesn't work. And so, and the course of socialism has proved that. But I think that's an uplifting thing to think about, is that the information age and the digital age is the equality of opportunity that we've all been hoping for.
Great point.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, these are really interesting times. I mean, I think we have some great opportunities here. The number one thing that I would say is just take responsibility for yourself. Strengthen ties with family and your community. Make sure that you know where your food comes from. Learn to defend yourself, and just ride the wave and try to take advantage of every opportunity that comes your way.
Yeah, and for me, what it takes to be a sovereign individual or transitioning into a more sovereign individual. I mean, the first answer is obviously Bitcoin. So if you don't know that by now, you might want to get some. But the other thing is the community. I don't want to be left out of the citadel, so to speak. One of the reasons is that I think it's just such a passionate, intelligent, growth-oriented community. I met Guy briefly, didn't even recognize him at the 2019 Bitcoin conference, and the people there were so passionate, and they wanted to change the world, and they didn't care about making money. I mean, they could actually define what money was, which is more than what most people could do. But you asked them immediately what they were going to want to do in the next 10 years, and almost all the answers were around education and building a community, and creating systems to help educate and help future generations. And, that's what the Citadel, would mean to me, and creating this community as early as often as you can, because, thinking 30 years down the road, if this Citadel thing is happening, then we're creating a community and an educational system and building, Web 2.0 or 3.0 or 6.0 or whatever that entails. And we're doing it to help the people around us. And I think that is a very exciting place. I think it was Satoshi that, it was Trace Mayer actually mentioned that he wanted to get it to the libertarians, and he wanted to get it to that group of people because he knew that those were the people that cared about changing the world in a positive way. And, that resonated with me, and I couldn't think of a better thing to do is start creating that community now, and then be able to act on that community in the future with people that want to have the same goals, which is that financial independence to make the world a better place. And I think there's a couple of stages of Bitcoiners. I think there's your early technology geek, you got your Austrian economics person, and then I think we're in the wave of the growth-minded, rapid learner, that's continuing to always educate themselves, ask questions that are curious, and are leveraging the internet for that. Podcasts, YouTube videos, the Sovereign Individual book. And I think, looking at Guy and John, your podcast, like that's what I see happening, and the people that can, jump down the rabbit hole, that's a real difference there. And I think for me, that's what the next stage of the sovereign individual is just really creating that community with people that are like-minded.
That's beautiful, man. I think that's the perfect place to end it, unless anyone has some final bits they want to add.
No, I think that's that's a good close. That's a good close.
Yeah, that's a good close. All right, guys. Well, look, it's been super fun. Before the internet connection craps out and I lose my daylight, I'm going to sign off. Thank you all for your input in this. I'm sure we'll do another one again sometime soon, if not another one on the sovereign individual, because I'm sure there's more to unwrap with it all. But always a pleasure speaking with you, Guy, and for the others that I've just connected with today. Thanks for coming on, and hope you're all well, and we'll talk soon.
Bye.
Peace. Later.